Hello, welcome to David's Den. I'm David, and I am doing a Stephen King readathon in publication order. Kingathon, if you will. If there is a cinematic adaptation of the book, I am also examining that, which brings us into the screening room today to discuss the 1997 miniseries adaptation of King's fourth novel, The Shining. That's right, I am not going to dissect the Kubrick film.
Here's Johnny!
But we will touch on that in just a minute anyway. Today, I'll be giving you my analysis and review of the 1997 The Shining without consideration of the source material, as if it were a standalone film. If you want to come along with me on the readathon or just want to hear my thoughts on how the adaptation compares to the book, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss next week's video where I take a deep dive into how successful the adaptation is in theme and tone, as well as the plot. Now, I should also take a minute to warn you that there are some minor spoilers ahead. I don't think I've included anything that would totally ruin the watching experience for you, but this is going to be a review along with analysis, so yeah, there will be spoilers. You've been warned. 90s CGI. I like this movie. I do, I really do, but I also admit that that might have a lot to do with how it honors the book, which I love so much. So it's going to be hard for me to separate this review from the adaptation correlation analysis that's ringing around in my head, and also from the Kubrick version, which is just objectively a better film. So forgive me if I have random tangential comments regarding those aspects, but as I was saying, I like this version. I mean, it has its problems, but I can write most of those off as casualties of the stylistic network television from the 1990s. Not that I'm absolving the actors or the director of all responsibility. Even Stephen King can be blamed for some of my concerns since he penned the screenplay himself, but The Shining has some very strong elements as well, especially on the design side, even winning Emmy Awards for sound editing and makeup, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. All right, here we go.
The board has decided to put an alcoholic less than a year away from his last drink in charge of one of the greatest resort hotels in America. May I be frank?
Oh, why stop now?
It makes me sick.
Nominated for an Emmy Award in the Outstanding Miniseries category, The Shining stars Steven Weber as Jack Torrance, a writer and recovering alcoholic who gets a job as the caretaker for the historic Overlook Hotel in its off-season during the harsh winter months in the Colorado Rockies. He moves into the palatial hotel with his wife, Wendy, and his son, Danny, but
I'm told that when you drink, you become emotionally unstable.
Well, since I'm no longer drinking, I
You
hardly
were
think
teaching at a prep school in Vermont? That was your last job? You beat up a student. Quite badly. That was less than 5 months ago, wasn't it? After you had quit drinking?
Get over here, you take your medicine!
Jack, what did you do to him?
Sorry, babe. It's just that since that George Hatfield thing, I can't see.
I don't believe you. Jack, what did you do to him?
So your family's mending?
I think it is, Doctor. We're trying to move on. What did you do to Danny?
If you're a drinking man, I hope you brought along your own supplies. This place has been picked clean. The employees had their end of the season party last night.
I don't drink.
until he does. The story of The Shining is a metaphor for a family torn apart by alcoholism and the cyclical nature of abuse, both physical and mental.
If it happens again, I'm sending the both of you to your mothers, and I know how you feel about her.
You have no idea how I feel about her.
Now will you stop with that crap?
I didn't mean to shake him. And I sure didn't mean to shout. I was scared.
I don't want this to be an angry place, Jack.
Shut up that drivel.
We've had enough of those in the family. God knows.
Daddy?
Your father and my mother.
Death doesn't mean much in the Overlook. Don't you know that?
Everything bad that happened here is still here.
The Overlook Hotel is the ultimate haunted house, serving as a symbol for Jack's psyche, and all of his personal demons wake up around him as he struggles to stay on the wagon, and they want just one thing only: the destruction of his family.
It wants us. All of us. But most of all, I think it wants me the most.
Hello, Danny. I've been waiting for you. We've all been waiting for you.
Well, it wants Danny because he has the Shining, which can make the evil spirits in the hotel stronger in terms of plot. But looking at the metaphor, it wants to destroy his family and leave lasting damage on his son's psyche.
Graham called it shining on. The Bible calls it having visions.
Danny's shine is a kind of ESP that lets him hear people's thoughts and have visions of the future. Sometimes these visions are presented to him by Tony, an imaginary friend that is actually a visual hallucination stand-in for Danny's powers.
Tony can show him the future.
Tony is the psychic element inside of Danny that presents itself in a way that a child can understand. Danny can talk to and ask questions of Tony, but whether or not he gets any answers is usually determined and often limited by the extent of his young child's understanding of adult concepts. Okay, there's the premise for you, and now I want to use two specific scenes as a jumping off point for this review and analysis. And I promise I may go on tangents, I will go on tangents, and talk about other moments to make my point, thus jumping off of each scene. See what I did there? But it will always come back to these two scenes as my primary examples. One for technical elements, and one for acting and direction. Before we hold our breath and just jump in, though, I do have to acknowledge a few things, starting with Elliot Gould. Elliot Gould, f***ing Elliot Gould.
I don't suppose you care much for me, Mr. Torrance.
On the contrary, Mr. Gould. Elliot Gould has 5 minutes of screen time, only 5 minutes, but he nearly steals the show for all 3 episodes as Mr. Ullman, the Overlook's manager. Of course, in the book, we do get a phone call to him later on, and he's referred to a lot, but here in the movie, he's a one and done. One scene to hire Jack and lay out some exposition, along with a cat. Welcome to DavidsDen, everyone. And then, after those 5 minutes, we never see him again. How did they ever get Elliot Gould to do this? Though I'm sure they paid him well. I mean, with the likes of Rebecca De Mornay and Steven Weber in the leads, this film obviously had a budget, but then again, they may have blown it all on Elliot Gould's salary and not had enough money left over for that fire hose. More on that in a bit. So we get 5 minutes of exposition from Mr. Ullman that, in a lesser actor's hands, would have been tedious.
It's called Denver croquet, invented by a man named Horace Derwent. As was the case with Derwent himself, everything in the game is larger than life.
It was Horace Derwent who built this hotel, right? I mean, in addition to inventing Denver croquet?
Not at all. The Overlook has been here almost since the turn of the century. Mr. Derwent was the man who rescued it from extinction.
Oh. The Overlook has been here almost since the turn of the century. How dare you ask me that question, you little pissant? Show some goddamn respect. But all said with subtext, and in an outward showing of the height of propriety. Stylistically, Elliot Gould plays it as if the scene were written for a comedy of manners, and he is the only actor in on the joke. Gould's Mr. Ullman literally has no other function from a plot standpoint than to give us information, and he absolutely kills it with his performance.
I actually find that rather comforting.
Now, before we go any further, I do want to address the Denver croquet mallet in the room. If Stanley Kubrick's 1980 film is considered such a masterpiece of cinema, why was it remade at all? Well, if you do just a little bit of digging online, you can find a lot of interviews with Stephen King or lectures he gave in which he mentions it, usually as part of the Q&A, since he's not allowed to speak of it anymore. Of course, there are changes from the book to Kubrick's film, as there are with any adaptation, and King has never spoken out so strongly against any other film based on one of his books. So, what makes The Shining so different?
Sort of picked up the phone and I said, "Stanley, how are you?" And he wanted to talk about ghosts. And wasn't the horror story, or the story of ghosts, always fundamentally optimistic? Because it suggested that we went on afterward. And I said, "Well, it is, Stanley, but what if a person died insane and came back?" There was a long silence. And I said, "Also, what about hell? What if there really is hell?"
Well, let's just say that I spent about 20 minutes writing up an explanation, figuring out the right words, agonizing over just how much to give away before I realized that was a topic better suited for the more spoiler-heavy adaptation correlation video, which I will start writing as soon as I am done with this review. So, let's just say that a lot of it had to do with the original themes and intention of the book being changed, as well as the ending. And yes, I know that the ending is different in the miniseries too, but not in the same way at all. It actually reinforces themes, even if I don't personally care for the change all that much. King was very vocal about his dislike of the Kubrick film and eventually decided he wanted to write his own adaptation that was a little more faithful to the source material. There was just one snag, though. Kubrick owned any sort of adaptation rights to the book, so King had to go ask permission to adapt his own novel. That's a fucking system, right? Kubrick allowed him to do so, but he had one single provision, that King would not badmouth his film anymore in public. So now he doesn't. He just says he doesn't like it and can't talk about it. Now, as I've alluded to already, one of those major themes that does work very well in King's version of the movie is the hotel as symbol for Jack's psyche. And that brings us to the first scene, which I really want to examine for its technical elements, but it's a jumping off point for the theme as well. So let's dive in. Jack finds a scrapbook in the basement, in the room right next to the boiler that is an ever-present threat, by the way. That's going to be important moving forward. And the scrapbook helps us tie everything together. It gives us the history of the Overlook quickly. It introduces most of the ghosts we are going to see through the movie. And of course,
everything bad that happened here is still here. It wants us.
All of the Overlook's ghosts are trapped inside the hotel, just like Jack's mind is stuck with his personal demons. They're not going anywhere. They're just adding to his stressors and the pressures building up in Jack's brain like the steam threatening to explode in the boiler in the very next room.
You gotta watch her, she creeps.
She's, what?
The boiler, she creeps. This whole place is gonna go Rocky Mountain High one of these days.
Yes, this is set up only 2 minutes into the first episode, and it is exactly the threat you think it is meant to be. But the question is not, can Jack kill his demons, but can he learn to live with them and thrive in spite of them? Or will he succumb to their evil temptations regardless of his responsibilities to self and family? Or will he explode trying? This, of course, also ties into the themes of the cyclical nature of abuse. What our parents left to us, intentionally or not, and what we leave to our children in the same way.
What are you doing, Doc?
Being someone else so it won't bother me. And she yells, or you push. Being someone else, sometimes that's better.
Just look at the woman in 217, I think symbolizing Jack's biggest fear and how determined she is to get to Danny.
Hello, Danny. I've been waiting for you.
That was...
Our psyches are made up of our histories, just like the Overlook is made up of its past indiscretions, and they are all trying to escape, just like the steam from the boiler. The bottom line here is that the themes that run through the movie are strong if you are open to seeing The Shining as metaphor rather than concrete story, which I would argue is a hallmark of all good horror stories. And similar to the book, the foreshadowing technique is solid, and you know what's going to happen at the end if you try to piece it together just a little bit. I mean, shit, that boiler comes back over and over again for 4.5 hours. And I don't think that ruins the movie. I think it is actually designed to purposefully shift your focus from the plot itself to the characters and their struggles within that plot. For this, Mr. King, for understanding it with your direction, Mick Garris, and for highlighting these moments beautifully with pieces of recurring melody, composer Nicholas Pike, thank you. A+, I say. A+.
You gotta watch her, she creeps.
Now, before we move on too much from this scene, which I've been setting up as next to the boiler room, but which we have not yet discussed in any way, let's just take a minute to talk about the wonderful score and fantastic sound design, the latter of which won an Emmy Award that I in no way wish to contest. Now, I'm not saying that Nicholas Pike's score is the best thing I've ever heard. Admittedly, at times it can feel a little cheesy, maybe even a little Home Alone-y. But I will write that off, along with so many other things, as being a product of its time. In fact, so many things that don't hold up or give me pause or stop me from ultimately rating this film higher than I will are what I consider byproducts of the 90s that haven't aged well. It's kind of like Marvin Hamlish, in my opinion. We love his music. A Chorus Line was a pivotal show for entertainment history, and personally, I love their playing our song. And the way we were, The Spy Who Loved Me, yeah. But come on, no one would ever not think those songs were written in the 70s. And even I Finally Found Someone is so entrenched in the mid-90s. I mean, I do like Marvin Hamlish, don't get me wrong, but he has always written music in a style that could be defined as popular music for its time. And not all of his music has aged so well, and at no fault of his own. Unless, of course, you want to fault the composer for not having the vision to create a piece of art for the ages, but hey, just because something doesn't live up to the test of time, I mean, that doesn't make it bad. Does it? And so it is with Pike's score for The Shining. It is, at times, the epitome of music composition for television in the mid to late 90s. But what I would rather look at is how it enhances the story, because that is what a film score is supposed to do. It's supposed to work with the plot and the visuals to enhance the storytelling. Except the opening credits, apparently. Oh, the score is appropriately unnerving, while also engaging, even if it is a mere rip-off of the Crow soundtrack from a few years earlier. It says, "Come here, I want to tell you a story, but be prepared, because I'm going to tell you a story." But there is no need for it. Why do these credits go on for so long? There should be 3 actors listed. 3. Okay, maybe 4. Maybe Marvin Van Peebles gets to be put in there as well. I think this is just a case of the convention of long opening credits in the 90s mixed with the desire to show off a nice piece of music. I'm sure there was also a need to kill time to fill a 2-hour block on television, which is probably where all of those long, lingering, unnecessary establishing shots of the Overlook come in. Oh, okay. Some of them are necessary, you're right, but we're not on the cinematography and editing yet. We'll get there soon. After one last afterthought on the opening credits.
You know what really grinds my gears?
Why does Rebecca De Mornay get top billing? The whole top billing thing, even as an actor who would love to have top billing in a feature film, I don't agree with it if I'm playing another lead alongside the actual protagonist. I would never expect it. The real, true lead, the protagonist of the story we're watching, should get top billing, followed by the supporting cast. And yes, I understand Rebecca De Mornay is the female lead, and one could argue that they put the 2 leads up there in alphabetical order, but more likely it was because De Mornay was the bigger star, the bigger name at the time. Though I'm also not so sure about that, because Steven Weber was coming off of Wings, which ran for 8 seasons, and actually had its series finale later in the same month that The Shining aired in 1997. But she was the movie star.
All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
There was definitely still a disconnect between the 2 mediums. Film actors didn't do TV back then. It was beneath them. And it was difficult for TV actors to cross over to film. But that's a whole discussion for another time, the billing thing. I don't agree with it.
That was clearly a tangent.
But the point is...
there is plenty of eerie music and loud, startling chords and bums through the whole film, yet it is also sparse when warranted. Choosing when to let the sound effects team take over with practical sounds and Foley art to help set the tone. And I would like to acknowledge that in my research, I could not find a specific credit for sound designer, and a team of 24 people are listed on the crew on IMDb, so yeah, I'll give them all credit as a team. Hell, they are listed as sharing the Emmy Award. I'm really happy that Pike and Garris didn't try to overdo the score, because there is just something so scary in hearing what's actually happening in the scene. There's a transcendental effect that makes you feel like you are, say, in the basement with Jack as he discovers the scrapbook, because he wasn't hearing any music. We were. Well, except maybe Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy, but that music was in his head. Here, let's take a look. As Jack is exploring, we have the hollowed out sound of a stone basement with no score to cut in or distract us. We are with Jack, hearing his footsteps on the concrete, the water dripping from the condensation on the pipes, his breath as he blows the dust away from the newspapers, even the rustling of his clothes. Then, as he discovers the book, here comes that single.
Whose memory book?
Whose memory book indeed, Jack. And thank you, King, for that obvious bit of dialogue. I love your books, but sometimes you should remember that not all of the thoughts you write into a book, not all of our thoughts are said out loud, or need to be to tell the story in a visual medium. But that single note is building as curiosity builds in Jack. And us, the audience, as Jack whispers the invitation out loud, the music cuts out, and its sudden omission draws our attention to the name Derwent.
Horace Derwent.
Where have we heard that name before?
It's called Denver Croquet, invented by a man named Horace Derwent.
Good shot!
Mr. Derwent was the man who rescued it from extinction.
Really, the music comes out because we are getting the first chords of Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy playing from the party as we transition to a flashback that is, of course, in black and white. Another convention that, while not solely a trait of the 90s, cries out that it was probably from the 90s. When the party fades and we return to Jack and the scrapbook, it's just going to be the dripping pipes again. I know that doesn't seem like much, but just listen to a dripping faucet and tell me you're not pissed off after a few minutes. Tell me that you hear water dripping on the floor and don't have an instant reaction to look for water so you don't slip and fall. It seems innocuous, yes, but the sound itself is naturally threatening to us. It's disarming. And there's Derwent, a face that is going to be very important to the film from this moment on, revealed in utter silence, except for the rustling of papers that subconsciously draws your attention to that unsettling silence. She's going to be kind of important later, too. Jack explores the book for a bit, and we get a brief history of the hotel changing hands through the years before... And out of complete silence, where the moment could have been scored, and indeed just was a moment before. The score doesn't come back in either until we switch to the long shot of Jack, and it subtly draws our attention to the change in cinematography, with staccato, opposing sounds before a swell. Time to stop with the camera's movement and allow the sounds of the Overlook's past to come through. Watch out, Jack! Ow! And then just listen to the metallic ringing of the springs working with the score. And then comes the voiceover added to it. Then it settles down a bit, hits that ominous chord of resolution and brings us back to the scrapbook and the gangland murder article. Bum, 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 bum. Just listen to that driving percussion. And then with a steady beat, driving us forward, and every camera edit punctuated with cascading sound effects increasing in volume as we cut in closer and closer on words like gangland and murder and mutilated. Then, with one final swell in the score, the book slams shut on its own and Jack goes running with only natural sound underneath him. Look, whatever you think about the musical quality of the score, it did its job. Ironically enough, what makes the score so strong is that it didn't try to do the job on its own, but rather worked in tandem with all of the other elements of the scene, especially the sound effects. So let's just scrap talking about score and sound effects as separate entities and say that all sound, in spite of how the score may vary or the purpose of, I don't know, say the water dripping, changes from scene to scene. This is a solid example of how sound works through the film as a whole. Before we move on, though, I would like to revisit those gunshots one more time. Why was there a sudden flash of color in the black and white memory? And why is the whole screen instead of just the muzzle flash? It happens nowhere else in the film. I mean, is it to tie the scene into the ghosts who appear in full color when they actually come to life later on? Personally, I think that's a bit of a stretch and a break in convention. It's more likely someone just thought, oh, that'll look cool. Hey, didn't they do that in The Crow? Let's do it here, too. Really, just how 90s can you be? And how much did The Crow influence design? Seriously, The Crow has so much more of a darker gothic feel, and I didn't actually notice the similarities until I started breaking it down and writing this script. But then again, if we're talking 90s tropes, I suppose it fits. And that brings me to a little rant I have about my problem with the movie as a whole before we go on to examine the acting and directing with the other scene I want to use as a jumping off point. Because, you know, I like to talk about the good in my reviews before I talk about the okay or so-so or the bad. It's just how I am. You guys, just give this movie a little bit of a break for the simple fact that it was made specifically to air on network television in 1997. Okay, this wasn't a home subscription service like HBO, pretty much the only subscription service that was just starting to create content of note back then. Plus, there are certain restrictions for time, which can dictate the pacing since there is a need to air commercials throughout the program, and this wasn't on TNT or some other cable channel. Being on network television, you could just grab out of the air with an antenna or even just some foil hooked up to your TV. There was definitely restrictions for content that are still, to this day, regulated by the FCC, so don't fault the movie for those things. Fault Stephen King. Fault Mick Garris. Fault whatever other producers had a hand in deciding that this should air on television. They all knew the source material, and it is tamed down, way down in places from the book. Now that being said, I think everyone did a great job taming it down. Maybe we don't get a shot of a fully nude woman in room 217, but we damn well know that she's nude, and she's scary enough. Ultimately, I only have slight reservations about how a few explicit moments were handled, but those are better saved for the adaptation correlation video. These guys actually did pretty okay. And now the pacing. I don't want to ignore the pacing issue because while it definitely keeps moving forward much more rapidly than the Kubrick version does, and I'm not bashing Kubrick here, that was the right choice for the film that he made, there are still a few moments in the miniseries that drag, and not in the good let's sit in this moment for a while kind of way. There's one scene in particular in the lobby when Wendy tries to get Jack to come to bed. It lasts a little over 11 minutes. Oh, there's a ton of information, and I will be using it as my example of a golden adaptation scene in the adaptation correlation, because it's not a bad scene. The writing of it isn't in error here, even if some of the dialogue is a little obvious at times.
If I have to be any more blunt than that, we're in a lot of trouble.
It's the static blocking for the actors. It's the slightly over-the-top acting, but again, that was just kind of the style of television movies in the 90s. The stagnant cinematography, the near absence of score, though possibly the right choice for that scene, did nothing to help tell the story, and you can just see De Mornay and Weber straining to move the emotions along and hit the beats they need to hit to keep the scene moving forward.
Danny says you've given up writing your play, Jack. Is that true? Because you always told me that next to Danny and me, your play was the most important thing in your life.
Has Danny been up in my office? Has he been fooling around with my papers? Damn nosy little pup.
You know, Jack, you're not drinking anymore, but all of your old drinking habits are back.
Did you catch that? That last bit? It's going to be important later. Outside of this scene, the only pacing issues I have are due to the television format and a child actor who drops his cues. But we'll hold on for a minute on that. We cut to black a lot and then come back in with these gorgeous exterior establishing shots of the hotel almost every time. I mean, Shelley Johnson's cinematography in these moments is beautiful, but it's unnecessary. It's bulky, right? I would actually suggest you watch The Shining as if it were on television in 1997. One episode a night for 3 nights, and whenever there's a slow fade to black, get up and go to the bathroom. Make a drink, do something else for 2 or 3 minutes, and then come back and hit play. Ultimately, this convention kills the pacing only because it's a style we're not used to anymore. It's a casualty of the no commercial, subscription service, cinematic quality binging that television has become. And another thing we get to take us into or bring us out of a commercial break fairly often are lingering, foreshadowing shots of the boiler, right? Or the haunted hotel making things move around. They may be a little overabundant, which I blame on needing to fill 3 2-hour blocks, minus commercials, but they work well, and they don't come out of nowhere. As the hotel comes to life around our characters more and more, the jukebox turns on by itself, or the liquor appears on the bar within the body of the story, between commercial breaks. And then there's my personal favorite, the Denver croquet mallet that just keeps showing up around the hotel. All of this constantly reminds us of the threat, the ever-present danger, and it builds suspense with a payoff later. Any movie where you actually shout, "Dump the fucking boiler already!" at your protagonist only halfway through means they've done something right to keep you engaged. I mean, I didn't do that. And what I meant was if someone were to shout at the screen, it would mean that they did something right. But yes, 90s, just look at Tony. Danny's vision friend floating there in oversized khaki. And thank you, Castle of Horror podcast, for pointing that out. But, I mean, I agree with you, Castle of Horror. Why is he floating? I mean, I get it. It makes him ethereal. It makes him other. And we understand he's not really there. But I think we got that already from the setup. It's a weird choice, and I can't put my finger on it, but I don't like it. Maybe it's because it's not justified somehow or consistent. If he always appeared floating, then, I don't know, I just think it's another thing of the 90s. We can float people and you can't see the strings anymore. Look, someone made Brandon Lee fly in the crow, so let's do that here. It's just embellishment that's more confusing than it is supportive. It's kind of like the black and white flashbacks and the bright lighting to indicate that we're in a vision. It's just what you did then, so someone said, let's do that. Not that it didn't look good for the time, but it just feels like overall I wanted something a little more inventive for the time. They seem to have said the same about most of the effects. If we can do it now, then let's do it. If we have the money for it. CGI was very cost prohibitive, even for big budget cinematic releases. And you can bet your ass that the only CGI involved with Tony floating was erasing the strings. The fire hose snap that we see at the beginning is not the best quality. Neither are the hedge animals. Now, I think what they did looked great for the time, and it's only the fault of technology that it hasn't aged well. What I really want to point out here is how creative Shelley Johnson and editor Patrick McMahon got to limit the amount of CGI that would be needed. Mother is the necessity of invention, right? The convention in the story is that
They don't move while you're watching them.
So instead, we get these quick cuts between the animals and Jack, each one emphasized by the score, while the sound of Jack moving through the crunchy snow further unnerves us, and the camera angles are skewed and stylistic, yes, maybe overly so, but that is a product of the 90s, and I think the effect is used superbly. So while actually seeing the animals moving was maybe not the most realistic, simply because it was cost prohibitive, the team was forced to use the CGI sparingly. And the accident here is that the limited use of the effect means that the reveal was used to great effect when we finally see it happening. Though I am painfully aware of the other two scenes with the hedge animals from the book that aren't in the movie. Like those other two hedge scenes, I'm sure a great deal of the things they sacrificed from the book were taken due to the cost of the effects. And if the choice is to scare us with moving plant, lions, rabbits, and dogs, oh my, or to scare us with a fire hose pretending to be a snake, well, I think the right choice was made. Now, I joked about the budget for the fire hose earlier. There is an entire scene in the book that requires the fire hose to come alive and chase Danny. We do get hints of this from the snap in the very first vision to the rack seeming to move on its own as Danny approaches room 217 for the first time. Actually, when it happens in the book, by the way. But it is reportedly said that the scene was ultimately cut because some insanely short amount of film time with a moving hose snake was going to cost $30,000. At this point, just make it a practical effect. But no, we can't do that now. This is the 90s. So, again, this should have been a cinematic release with a higher budget and free from the constraints of network television. I blame you, Stephen King, Mick Garris, and whatever other producers had a hand in this decision. Again, I know I blamed you before, but I'm blaming you again. Deal with it. No, I really do. I love your work, Stephen King. Please don't stop writing. Just maybe think about how you do screenplays. Another trademark of the 90s style television is that stagnant camera. Oh, Mr. Johnson varied it a bit, sometimes in exciting ways like with the topiary, but it's almost always with the upshot, which only remains effective if it's not overused. For the most part, the miniseries gets the simple framing we saw in the hotel lobby scene earlier. And other than outside with the topiary, it was never varied enough to catch us as off guard as I think the story requires, unless it was coupled with a nice bit of score to draw our attention to it, like switching to the long shot on Jack with the scrapbook. A blatant example that shines a light on what we get most of the time happens when Wendy pulls confetti and party favors from the elevator. Come on now, that's just laziness. Put some set dressing where we can see it. Or if you want the reveal when she throws it out, let it appear around her. Mind blown. Cut to a shot of the floor where it's all strewn about after she throws it because she still has more shit to throw out. Don't just try and hide a pile of shit behind the wall that, through its use by the actress, becomes just an obvious pile of shit that someone hid behind a wall so the actress could throw it out.
What's that? Is this a short circuit?
Okay, maybe that was a little harsh. There aren't a lot of extreme examples like this one, but that moment made me roll my eyes a bit and think that even with the flat, studio set style cinematography convention of the times, someone could have put a little more effort into that. And we know that Shelley Johnson can do it. He went on to film Jurassic Park 3 just a few years later, followed by Captain America, The First Avenger, and Dunkirk from just a few years ago. No, these movies didn't win Johnson any Academy Awards or anything, but they prove he is better at his craft than one would think from his work in The Shining. Which leads me to say once again that not only is the rewatchability of The Shining a casualty of the times, but this should have had a higher budget and a cinematic release. I want you to remember the things I said about the cinematography moving forward, because while I don't feel a need to repeat my points or draw your attention to it again, you will be able to see what I'm talking about through that next scene, which I would like to examine more as a jumping off point for the acting and a little more about the direction. At this point in the story, Danny has been choked and has bruises on his neck from the woman in 217.
That was...
Jack has gone to the room to check it out, and although he has had his own ghostly experience, with a push-in from the camera, an unnatural lighting change, and an eerie chord from the score, the hotel gets into him, and he falls deeper into madness, into his old alcoholic habits like chewing Excedrin. I told you this was all a metaphor, and this little bit that sets up the scene I want to talk about is just a nice moment where it all comes together. Jack returns to his family in the caretaker's apartment, seemingly composed, but actually at the mercy of his demons. I mean, at the mercy of the hotel.
And I think, son, it's time once again for one of our little chats about where you're supposed to go in this hotel and where you're not supposed to go.
I couldn't help it. I really couldn't.
Leave him alone,
No,
Jack.
it's funny because my father never bought that couldn't help it stuff. Of course, it was one of the few things in his life that he was right about, but he thought it was crap, and so do I. That's crap!
He just had a terrible scare.
Here we go. A little sweeping in with the camera, but pretty straightforward framing with the sounds of a crackling fire and a lack of score to let the reality of the moment land. We start right off with a mostly solid performance from Weber, except for that exasperated laugh that you know is necessary just to get the line from point A to point B as it is written. Or is it?
I couldn't help it. I really couldn't.
Leave him alone,
No,
Jack.
it's funny.
I actually don't have a problem with this section of dialogue because the word funny, the way he's using it, is not meant funny, ha-ha. Weber does have a nice transition to the anger moment once he kind of finds his footing again. Note the thematic element of cyclical abuse coming from the grandfather through the father to the son.
He thought it was crap, and so do I. That's crap!
But if I were an actor forced to wait for a child actor to pick up his cues late, and then, when he finally does say his line, who does nothing more than lean forward to indicate a sense of horror, which only feels real in the sense that we think Cortland Mead was horrified because A, he thought he had forgotten his line, and B, the director told him not to get up or move. Then yeah, I'd throw a little laugh in too to help me get from point A to point B.
Leave him alone,
No,
Jack.
it's funny.
And I don't mean to berate a child actor. Okay, I think the kid turns out a decent, if not okay, to maybe good performance for a child actor in a horror film. I'm using this moment more to point out the cast's spotty chemistry with one another and how they all seem to be indicating what the characters want and need rather than fighting for it.
He just had a terrible scare.
Did he, Wendy? Did he really? Where are the stakes? Right? Are you really afraid? Because that sounded a little bland to me. Did you really mean to impress on Jack that he needs to calm down? Because where was the insistence? right? Wendy is stronger-willed than that. But of course, Garris and Johnson probably told Rebecca De Mornay not to move from the couch for most of the shot. There's just an artificiality about the staging that seems to tie the actors' hands when it comes to living their characters' truths in the moment. And it's not like De Mornay is a bad actress or doesn't have good chemistry with Weber in general. We can see glimpses of it through the film. They just work so well together for most of it. That lobby scene, for example, but here...
Listen to yourself, Jack. You are threatening a 7-year-old boy. Just stop it.
There it is. There's the passion I need and the chemistry I want. It's amazing what can happen when the character wants to move and protect their child versus when the actress is told to sit still in that same moment.
You guys talk like it's a snap. There's 30 inches of snow on the ground.
How much?
30 inches!
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm not sure I would have known if you hadn't indicated with the top half of your body while you're firmly plant your feet on the floor. Why aren't they moving? And yes, he did get up and move, and I think that was the right choice. But why is he standing still? And why does he have to indicate? We just saw the snow out the window. But then again, this is a general habit Steven Weber has as an actor that I don't think makes him bad, but it has always bothered me. You can see it in Wings and Dracula, Dead and Loving It, which came out shortly before this, along with Jeffrey, and, well, I mean, that style is wonderful for sitcoms and spoofs and campy gay rom-coms from the 90s. Not so much for a horror film. We want something a little more real, I think. Right? We want to believe that Jack is scared or insane and not just see the actor's technique behind it being played out on the surface. And now that I have ripped him apart, I also want to say that I think Steven Weber is a decent actor. And I read that he was chosen for this role only 4 days before filming began. If this is true, of course, some of his acting habits came to the surface. He had to work quickly. Regarding Weber as an actor generally, I think he's fun to watch. I enjoy a lot of his work, and he does have some fantastic moments in The Shining. Ultimately, though, he was playing against type and on short notice. And I'm sorry, Steven, I just wanted something a little bit more. Now, I also have to admit that it is hard to separate Steven Weber's performance of Jack Torrance from what we know of Jack Nicholson's performance, right? So, kudos to you, Mr. Weber, for even taking on the role. I know it wasn't easy. Jack Torrance is kind of like the King Lear of cinema. Every actor wants a crack at that part, but unlike a play, it won't be recast over and over again in different venues. It's not one night for an audience and done. Right? There's film to be bought and rewatched. There are clips to be shown on television and in YouTube reviews. Jack Nicholson's iconic performance was captured for all time. So when Gary Sinise, who had worked with King and Garris on The Stand, was offered the role, he turned it down for fear of being compared to Jack Nicholson. Gary Sinise, an established film star at the time, just like Rebecca De Mornay. Then the role was offered to Tim Daly, among others, and of course Daly turned it down as well, but suggested his Wings co-star, Steven Weber, who had the courage to take it on. So I'm going to pull your performance apart, Mr. Weber, but I do it with the utmost respect. Now, in the spirit of full disclosure, it is reported in places that Tim Daly recommended Steven Weber, and in others that it was Rebecca De Mornay. I couldn't find a connection between De Mornay and Weber before this movie, so I think it was more likely that it was Tim Daly. If you have the concrete answer, please let me know down in the comments below. I would love to know how it went down.
You guys talk like it's a snap. There's 30 inches of snow on the ground. 30 inches!
And a snowmobile in the equipment shed, big enough to seat 4. There's only 3 of us, and Danny's small.
Oh, that's right. That is right, Ms. De Mornay. Fight with your husband. Fight to protect your child. Fight with all you have, but do it from that seat on the couch while Steven Weber claps out each point he makes. Oh, okay. You know what? I can hear myself making the same gripes over and over again, and I'm giving a bad impression. This scene is not terrible. And once Wendy stands up to confront Jack, the scene is still too immobile, but at least we get the Weber-De Mornay chemistry back. It's just an amalgam of all the things that bother me here and there about this movie crammed together in one place, from slow pacing and dropped cues to the weaker elements of the direction and cinematography.
I hate you both! I hate you both! You're stupid and I hate you both!
Oh, well, I think that might be a little too harsh, Danny, but hey, at least you can run out of the room in a way that leaves your parents framed perfectly by the doorway for a final shot to end the scene. Obviously staged. Look, I really thought I was going to spend a lot more time on this scene, but in a way I kind of did. We covered the cinematography and most of the directorial points I had before we got to it. It's just a great example of those. And from an acting standpoint, I think my feelings can be summed up just by saying this was made in the 90s. Weber is an actor who came to fame in a 90s sitcom, and De Mornay was a film star taking on a television role which was beneath her. Not at all for the role, but simply for being on television. Now I'm the one saying that, given the entertainment mores at the time. She was actually attached to the project right from the beginning, jumping at the chance to play Wendy after King himself wanted her to play it. She read a draft of the screenplay 3 years before it ever shot or aired and got on board. Now that being said, I also don't think De Mornay turned out her best performance. I usually expect a little more from her. Cortland Mead is a passable Danny Torrance, though I think they could have found a more experienced actor better suited for the material. Will Horneff is appropriately weird, I guess, as Tony. Melvin Van Peebles does his best to stumble through the dialogue of a 1970s stereotype of a black man that wasn't updated from the book to the miniseries that was made and takes place 20 years later. He's silly and endearing, and it's not a strong performance, but it does the trick. Of course, we have Elliot f***ing Gould. More like Elliot f***ing Gold, am I right? Huh? John Durbin inhabits the bisexuals are evil trope of Horace Derwent with a remarkable grace and commitment.
Slide him once on the thigh for me, darling.
And that makeup is amazing. All right, I know. Oh, that's Star Trek. I can't pull anything over on you guys. But would you believe that's the same actor? That was for you, Sean. And that brings me to my last design element that I want to talk about. Now, this is going to sound a little weird, so give me a minute to explain. The Emmy Award-winning makeup design is consistently inconsistent, and that makes it consistently wonderful. Now, what I mean by that is that the makeup effects are used to varying degrees based on who is in the scene, right? Are we seeing something through Jack's eyes, or do we see it the way Danny experiences it? Which, of course, is also dictated by what plot point needs to be presented in that moment. When Jack first enters the party, for example, not only does the period hair and makeup look great, but everyone there has a pale face with just a touch of dark shading under their eyes for the feel of something not quite right. Something dead, but also something that wouldn't overtly draw Jack's attention. But when Jack has a moment of lucidity and sees through the hotel's manipulation briefly, Rita Hayworth goes grotesque. And once again, there are a number of people listed on the makeup crew, 14 to be exact, with no official designer credited. So I will just give credit to the team effort as the hair and makeup department because they are all, again, listed as winning the Emmy Award. Bravo. I mean, before I say bravo, though, another fine example is Danny's vision versus real life. He sees his father with green lighting behind him and coming at his face in these early visions, and the makeup used the lighting because the green helps to make his face look like it's dripping off. But when that vision turns into reality at the end of the movie, that same makeup is just his father's dirty, bloody, crazed face minus the creepy contact lenses. And we can see what it looks like without the green luminescence. Like the lack of score giving something fictional a feeling of reality, it makes the moment even scarier than the grotesque imagery we had gotten used to seeing. And this is to say nothing of the makeup effects for the woman in 217. I read that they used a lot of saran wrap and KY jelly in an extreme process to make that happen. There's also the transformation of Stephen King for his cameo as the band leader at the party. I mean, bravo, hair and makeup. Now I'll say it. Bravo. So to wrap this up, I just want to say again that I like this movie. I think it actually has a lot to do with my fondness for the book, so I'm going to try to rate this as best I can on its own merits as a film. The acting and the visual style are so firmly entrenched in 90s television that parts of the movie have been a casualty of the change in how we consume media. And some of the effects also haven't aged well. I blame most of this just on the passing of time, but I also lay some of that blame on King and the producers for deciding to make this for network television. The acting is mostly decent, if not good, with a few problems that arise due to, I think, the direction and the cinematography, which is beautiful at times, but Doesn't do much to enhance the story the way the score and the sound effects do. Well, except for that topiary, of course. I don't think this is a great movie worth near 5 stars, but it's also better than just an okay movie settling somewhere in the 2 to 2.5 range. So I'm going to give the 1997 miniseries The Shining a final rating of 3.5 stars. Maybe just 3. No, I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt. 3.5. Thank you for tuning into the Screening Room Review here in David's Den. Before you leave, just go ahead and give this video a like if you enjoyed it. It's a little thing from you, but it really does mean a lot to me, so thank you so much. Also, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss that adaptation correlation where I'll be making an in-depth comparison of this same movie to its source material. And I might have another little surprise for you in the meantime, too. I don't know. Kind of still working on the idea. And then I'm moving on to the first collection of Stephen King's short stories, Night Shift, which means that we are getting very close to Cat's Eye and Children of the Corn. See you then.